to Douglas Stewart last month about this. He wrote Shuggy Bay. And I said, what do? Do you plan? Do you like make an outline, or do you just go into writing? Because I said Shuggy Bain was like you just sat down one day with some haggis and an iron brew and decided to write a book. And he said, well, and so then I asked Alexander Chee, another writer, and I asked Meredith Hall, and I asked Canon Jones, who's a brilliant writer and also a sheep farmer. And they all said sort of different things, but sort of the same. The main theme was this. When you're starting to work on a new project or a book or a short story, you write enough to where you feel the spark, the connection with the characters, that electricity. That's what you do. Just write enough, and then you can plan. So if you start planning, like Al Zuckerman, an agent in New York, who was Michael Crichton's agent, he did a lot of big deals, Jurassic Park. He said he wants to see a 20,000 word outline. But to me that sounds horrible and prosaic and boring. But when I talk to other writers, they say, no, you free write until you've got the genie, the spirit of the story. Mm-hmm. You know, the feeling of it. And when you've got that, then you can start making an outline. And I said, well, why? Why not just keep going, with the genie? And they said, because it would add an extra 2 years to the project, because you'd be writing things that essentially will be cut. So I said to them, how long does it take you to get into it before you have the spirit, you have the characters in here? And they said between 30 and 70 pages.
Wow.
So it depends how well you know the characters. And for a short story, that might be 1 or 2 pages before you know you've got something. So that said, if you're working on a book, or how do you find stories to begin with? Well, the best advice I can give you from my experience is you're not going to write anything good unless you're writing about something that you would put on the page, even if it doesn't get published, even if no one reads it. It's that important to you to get it out. Because then that's going to be something really real and really true. Think about how much pop music, if the producers weren't going to make a lot of money from it, they wouldn't make it. The music's always crap, for the most part. But then there's songwriters who, they don't care if they sell it, but it's from an experience they had with, say, a sister who died of cancer or a former lover, and they have to write this song. And it's brilliant because it's true, it's authentic. So the thing is, there's a lot in your past that's unresolved relationships with people, maybe with parents, because often in life we find ourselves loving people we don't like that much, or we find that we're not loved back in the way we want to be. And so all these sorts of undecorated, unfinished rooms live in the houses of our lives, right? So we've all got a lot of stuff we can write about, but how do we know what room to decorate? How do we know which one? Well, my advice to you is, when you go out into the world to see that exhibition on shoes for little dogs, then what will happen is you'll make a connection somewhere. Or you'll be on the subway coming back from the exhibition, and you'll see a man in his 80s wearing one shoe, completely dressed normally, but he's missing a shoe. He lost a shoe. And something about that man will connect with you on a really deep emotional level. You'll be like, that's my father in the early stages of dementia. And you'll be like, oh man, I gotta write about that. You'll feel it. You'll feel like the pressure behind your eyes, that where you could cry. That is the beginning of something. That's the spark. And then you really have to be disciplined. And I'm going to go into 6 steps in a minute to sustain that. But getting a story is really about being open to new things, leaving your comfort zone, and then allowing yourself to connect emotionally, usually through the lens of compassion, I would say, and empathy. Because you can't write anything good when you're angry. Even a letter to the PTA is too much, it's not effective. So it's really about that emotional connection, I think, and being compassionate and being open. And when you're connected, you're outward facing rather than inward facing. I mean, there's a time to be inward facing, but I think in order to connect the world to one's experiences, that spark, because the writing is a personal thing, but it is going to be read by others. What I'm trying to say is, it's your story, but it only comes to life when they read it, when they make sense of the words from their experience of life. So if I said, the bear appeared at the back door with a hungry look in its eye, you moved quickly behind a table and noticed that your mother was still in the chair listening to her music on headphones. Everyone in this room has imagined a different bear, a different back door, a porch, different glass, a different temperature in the room, a different feeling of the room, a different mother, a different table, and yet it's the same story. So what happens is when you're writing from your experience, but when the person reads it, they're never going to imagine it the way you did. And that's why, you don't have to say that much. All you're doing, so it's really an emotional skill, if that makes sense. It's unlike science writing. It's where you just sketch just enough where the other person can see themselves in it. But of course with language doesn't work unless the other person has experience of what those words are. Because if I said umbawi, he went home and took out his umbawi, we wouldn't know what that means because we don't know what an umbawi is. So it's impossible. But if I say he went home and took out his binoculars, we know what binoculars are, so everyone in this room is imagining a slightly different set of binoculars. That's really how you start, I think, is making sure you have that emotional connection. And then that leads you think you're entering the life of the man with one shoe, but oh no, actually that is leading you into one of your own rooms. A room that you maybe haven't visited for a long time, a room where you might find very painful memories, but that is the story that is meant to be told. You see? So essentially you leave home to find home. You have to go in order to come home. You see what I mean? Now some people can find things like that through prayer or meditation. But my advice is just to be out in the world connecting in an empathetic way. A samurai master said that you go out and pretend you've died and you're a ghost. And all this is happening regardless of whether you perceive it or not. Do you see? So when you walk through Sag Harbor, instead of, when I walk through Sag Harbor, that used to be that, blah, blah, blah. It's just imagine I'm dead and just observe what's happening. And it would be happening if I wasn't there. That's quite interesting. That's quite interesting because then you're free of prejudgments and you're a bit more open in a way that I think is useful to you as an artist. So I suppose good writing explores the self through the dissolution of ego, if that makes sense. Right, so once we've got ideas, we've got some ideas, we've felt that, as Chaucer might say, that prick, in spring, and the animals all wake up and want to have sex. We felt that prick. Prick's probably the wrong word to use in this context. But you know what I'm talking about. We felt it. We've got something to write about. Now, how do we keep the flame going? How do we keep that going? Well, the first thing is to have a space that is exclusively your space for writing. Exclusively yours. Now, if you write, if you share it, if you live with people, then you might think, I don't have to follow this step because I live alone and I just write at my desk. But here's the rub. Do you also shop on the internet through that? Do you go on to your credit card statement and be like, what? How's it so much? You know, do you also do that at the desk? Because then it's not exclusively a writing place. So you know when you go into like a temple or a church or like a mosque or something like that, any religious place, I always go in and I smell the buffet getting prepared. I'm curious about this religion. So go into any religious place and you'll see like iconic things, a candlestick, bowls, bizarre looking spoons, and you know, is it a bowl? Yes. Is it a spoon? Yes. But it's not, because it has a ritual significance. So, you know, is that just a tablecloth? It's probably from IKEA. But in the church, you know, it's something holy. So your writing space has to be a holy place, in the sense that it's not just a normal spoon. It's not just a normal tablecloth. If that makes sense. It has to be the place where you write fiction, and that's because when you go to write, if you want to be prolific, it's hard if you keep getting distracted by other things that you do at that desk. You see what I mean? Or in that writing place. So then, if you live in a very small apartment or a house, and you know you have access to the kitchen table, and that's where you do everything, then you can put a tablecloth. Put a tablecloth, light a candle, have one of those, you know, religious candles from the bodega with like something written in Spanish and a saint. You know, you've seen those. Or put a menorah. I know it's not Hanukkah, but why not? And something that makes you feel like, this is it. I'm entering a different consciousness. And that's what good writing is. It's really a type of meditation. It's a type of prayer. Because you're sharing a part of yourself with the world that would otherwise stay completely hidden. When people read your work, they want to be like, my God, you're interesting. Like, I never knew this stuff about you. And you might be like, yeah, me neither. You know, because it's really coming out. It's like Orpheus leaving the underworld. You know, you always want to turn back and see, but you can't. You just have to keep going. So, I think that's quite important, to have a space that's yours. Even if you use a table. Well, I used to use a folding desk from IKEA. It was about $5–10, and eventually it warped with age, but it was very good, and I could put it in the cupboard, and then nobody else used it. Don't touch that desk, you know. But then I told my mentor Barbara about this, and she said, "Oh God, don't be such a stupid bastard." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "The only thing you need to write is you." And that's quite a nice thing to say, really. Barbara's one of those people who helps you by first insulting you. So that the second step is to choose a time and stick to it. One of my obsessions for a few years was boxing, and so I would go and talk to boxers, you know, and you know, go to boxing matches. You know, it's a bit boring after all. You know, I had my Pokemon cards, but you know, you talk to boxers, and they're all quite interesting people. They have quite high voices, which is fascinating. But I would say to them, like, so do you ever get sick before a fight? Was one of my questions. And a boxer from where was he from? Suriname. He said, "No, never get sick before a fight." I said, "But you can control when you get a cold." He says, "I don't know, but I never get sick before a fight." And I think that's because his body knew that he was going to go into a fight. He knew at 9 o'clock at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, he was getting into the ring, and he was like going to have to go into action, right? And if any of you have ever done any sort of boxing, it's not like it's not like in karate where you have when you're doing a new belt, you have a practice routine. You know, in boxing, you don't have time to. You're relying on the instincts that you've picked up from constant practice. like pianists in a concert hall are not thinking, they're just doing. In the Chinese tradition of wu wei, to do without doing. So it's instinct. And so essentially boxers and writers are very similar. They have to be very disciplined in when they train and when they... And so when you choose a specific time to write, you have to go. Because your mind is thinking, your mind is gearing up. That cupboard is getting ready to spill open. Now, some people might be skeptical about this, but when I've spoken to people who were in the military, and I say, what was the hardest part about, being in the army, apart from losing friends and stuff like that, and being away from home? And they all agreed, the hardest part was being in, Somalia or being here for a week, and any second they could be called to go on the mission. They're prepared, they've built a mock-up of the compound, they've gone through it, they know where everything is, they can do it all in the dark, and then they're like, sorry lads, you have to go home. It's been solved diplomatically. They said that was the hardest thing, and then they would just go out and pound drinks and get into fights and get into trouble and jump off bridges into rivers, in the middle of London, and get arrested, because they said your mind prepares you. And so I think that for writers that's also very true. So you have to choose a time and really stick to it, even if it's half an hour. A lot of people after taking a course, they'll say, okay, yeah, I'm going to do 5 hours, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday I'm going to do 9 hours. So be realistic. Be realistic. And find a time too is when you're most prolific. I'm most prolific between the hours of 7 and 11.
AM or PM?
AM. Good question. Some people, Anne Michaels, who wrote Fugitive Pieces, she's most prolific between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. So she would go to bed with her kids at 7 o'clock when they were very young, get up, right? Like she was living in the 1700s. Get up and then go back to bed for an hour and then get up with them and cook breakfast. And I said, why? She said, well, when they're in their beds where nothing can hurt them. So I can finally relax. So choose a time, have your place for writing, and you will be surprised how prolific you are. Even if it's 2 hours a week, your mind will be ready. So sometimes in those 2 hours, when you've told yourself I'm going to write, you will write more than a 6-hour stint on the train to Boston or something. The third thing then is to set the right conditions. Do you get hungry when you write? You don't want to be getting up mincing around with potato salad and then everything's in the dishwasher, so you have to use a fish knife. You don't really want to be doing that. So if you have to prepare food, put soup in a thermos, really prepare, like you're going on a hike. You've got your foil blanket in case you break an ankle. So it's very important that you set the right conditions. Do you need music? Do you need the AC cranked? Do you need heat? Some Roald Dahl used to get into a sleeping bag and then sit in his big chair and pull his desk. You see what I mean? Because he liked being in the cold, but it made him feel snug. And so if you look at all great writers, they've set the conditions that make them most prolific. Because it's hard to have a long-term writing practice if we're just finding an hour here or 2 hours there. It's just not sustainable. Just like when those times when we've tried foolishly to get fit, and we think, well, I'm going to do this, I'll go for a run there, but it has to be a routine. So what you're doing is you have to make a habit of it. And the habit has to be you have to really stick to it. In the same way that some people have to go for dialysis, or blood transfusions. I mean, this is something very important. I think a lot of writers do so because a lot of writers write because it balances their mental health. Certainly for me, if I don't write, I find it very difficult to function in the world without becoming over-emotional or over-critical. So writing is in some ways a kind of medicine, but art in general is medicine. for the world, you know, because each one of us is in a type of prison where there's no doors, there's no guards, there's no locks. But until we read a book or see a work of art that makes us realise, my God, I've been treating my mother-in-law has been wanting to reach out, and I've been, you know, books and art free us from prisons we didn't realise we were in. So the book that you're writing, someone out there now is going to be emancipated by your work. So at its highest level, art is a kind of medicine. It heals us, it inspires us, and it's a medicine that, you know, hopefully people find when they most need it. Just in some ways, it's a medicine for us to actually do the writing itself. So we've got find a place that's yours, choose a time and stick to it, set the conditions. Do you need a candle? Does it have to be a diptyque candle? Okay. Number 4, choose a media. Choose media that you like. So, for instance, Nabokov wrote on index cards, and he kept them in his pocket. So he could, you know, wherever he was, if he went out to the woods for an hour, he would be writing on index cards. And then I think his wife typed them up for him. He wrote on index cards. Roald Dahl used to handwrite on a giant piece of plywood that he would sit in a big armchair and he would have it. You see what I mean? So choose something that you might not like to write on a laptop. You might like to write on an electric typewriter, or you might like to free write, or write on a Kindle or something. I don't know if you can write on Kindles, because I've never had one. But an iPad, I guess. So try out a few things and find out what actually you like the best. Because remember, to write a book, you're going to spend a lot of time using this medium. So it's important that you're comfortable with it, you like it. So that's very important. And then, so you're choosing the right medium for you to express yourself. And then number 5 we've already been over, which is to read only books you love. Read only books you love. And then number 6 we've been over, and that's stay inspired. So reading books you love and indulging your curiosities and interests will keep you inspired. Because sometimes writers will come to me and they're like, oh, I'm bored, I'm in the middle of this book, it was going well, and now I'm bored with the characters, I'm bored with it, what do I do? And I say, well, what initially drew you to write about this, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, okay, so let's go out to a thrift store and let's buy the clothes of one of the main characters. So in the thrift store, it'd be like, well, why this dress? Oh, well, she loved fabric. And then they start to make it up. Well, her father brought this fabric home from work one day. And how does she feel about her father? Oh, she misses him. And then they think of their own fathers. And then you start to get re-inspired with the book. So sometimes you have to build a collection of things that belong to the characters. A shoebox. Or go to a thrift store and buy, I'm always buying bras, and it sounds kinky, but in thrift stores for my characters. This is how it feels. This is how the fabric feels, on the skin. This is their favorite bracelet. This thing from a thrift store, a little locket. That's the only evidence this character has that she was loved. Do you see? So when you start, so you need to connect back emotionally to the characters. But usually I find when somebody comes to me and they're having a problem writing, it's because they're not following the 6 steps. They don't have a place they can really work. They're not writing regularly. They're not reading anything they love. The most common reason for writers having writer's block, in my experience as an editor, is they're not reading enough. They're not reading books they love. They're reading for work, or they just haven't found anything. Or they've gone through a transition in life and they're having a hard time adjusting. But that's an easy one to fix, actually. So we've talked about the 6 steps. I've got a little more time, I think, unless anyone has to go exactly at noon. We started a bit late. It wouldn't be fair if I stopped now. So we've gone through the 6 steps, really. We talked about finding stories. So I'll go over a few things that just might help you. First thing now is to just accept that you're never going to feel good about the book until it's finished. You're always going to feel like it's in a state of undress, that it's at any moment going to spectacularly collapse. That's totally normal. There's no real sense of joy or happiness with the work, until it's close to not being yours anymore, until you're going to send it out. That doesn't mean you'll have moments of joy with sentences. You'll be at your computer or typewriter and you'll get a section you write and you'll be like, damn, that's good. And you'll go out and have a 10th cup of coffee to celebrate. And then the next day you're like, yeah, but now the rest of it is shit. Because that sentence is so good. You see what I mean? So the thing is, you just have to keep going. And some days you'll come up with amazing work and you can't believe you've written 3 amazing pages. And the next day you'll be like, well, I guess that's it. Today I wrote 3 or 4 mediocre pages. I asked Michael Cunningham about this, and he said you have to clock in and clock out. So he said, when I flick through the hours, he said, I can't tell the good days from the bad days. Because I clocked in and clocked out, and in the editing everything gets made sort of flush, consistently good. An Irish writer, John McGahan, he said that when you do write those, there's one John McGahan book here in the youth section, by the way, but when you do write those sentences that are really profoundly good and that are very much you, he said you use that as a tuning fork to pull all the others up. Like that's the level now. But obviously, like in a symphony, there has to be variation in a novel. Unlike a short story, which can be very tonally intense for the duration of it, but in a novel, we need like the adagio, we need the adagietto, we need like all the different movements. Some are fast, some are slow. We look at Beethoven's the famous Moonlight Sonata. If you listen to the movements that precede and what's the one after? Proceed?
Succeed.
Oh my God, thank you so much. 48 years of my life, I have never... Okay, I'm going to start using that now. Succeed. So it's like some people say, you need to find stuff within, not just without. I'm like, really? You can use without in that context? So, yeah, in Beethoven's, the Moonlight Sonata, the movements that precede and succeed are very different. Very different. So in a novel, you want that variation, but at the key landing points for the reader, you do want it to be very powerful, very distinctly you. And here's another thing that I found very useful, is that writing and writing a book are very different things. Now, some people will send work to an agent or an editor that is brilliant writing, but it's definitely not a book. It's just brilliant writing that doesn't conform to the structure of a novel, which writers will tell you, it usually works, this structure. It's the best we can do now. And you can experiment, of course, but writers have tried things. This is why second person is not used very much. So writing and writing a book are very different. So you might be an excellent writer, but just not yet be good at writing a book, you see. So I see writers who have a really good skills, a really unique voice. I see them lose heart because they can't get anywhere with selling their book. But what they don't understand is that whereas their writing is excellent, it's not really a book because they haven't studied the actual structure of novels, the craft. Like Edward Hopper had to learn how to paint curved glass because that was so essential to his paintings. So until you can look at a novel and say, read it as an editor and see how the structure is, it's actually very hard to come to terms with that in one's own work. So this is the case when an editor, a magazine editor or a book editor or an agent sends you a note back saying, not for us, but keep me in mind for your next book. That means that, it could mean many things, but in many cases it means that your writing is very good, but the structure of the book is just not working. And I find that's probably the majority of my job as an editor, is working with people who are good writers, but they don't know what they don't know, which is in terms of structure.